On a cold December morning in 1916, German and Austro-Hungarian columns moved toward Bucharest, and at Gara de Nord soldiers guarded freight cars loaded with sealed crates from the National Bank of Romania. Inside those wagons lay more than bullion. There were gold bars, gold coins, state records, private deposits, and cultural valuables. Together, they formed the Romanian Treasure, the financial heart of a kingdom at war. This train was sent away for protection, but within months, that protection would become an accusation. Romania would claim that an ally had taken its national gold. Russia, then torn apart by revolution, would answer with politics, law, and silence. The train did not vanish into myth. Its route was documented. Its cargo was recorded. Its guards were real. Its destination was real. What changed was the world around it. To understand how a nation could lose its gold by train, you have to return to Romania in 1916. Romania had entered the First World War on the side of the Allies, hoping to gain Transylvania, a region ruled by Austria-Hungary but home to a large Romanian-speaking population. For King Ferdinand I, Queen Marie, and Prime Minister Ion I, C. Bratianu, the war looked like a chance to complete the national dream. But the gamble was dangerous. Romania was surrounded by enemies on several sides. To the north and west, Austro-Hungarian forces held the Carpathian passes. To the south, Bulgaria threatened the Danube frontier. Germany, under the command of generals such as Erich von Falkenhayn and August von Mackensen, moved with the speed and organization that had already made the Central Powers feared across Europe. The Romanian campaign did not unfold as Bucharest had hoped. The army fought hard, but it was stretched across too many fronts. German, Austro-Hungarian, Bulgarian, and Ottoman pressure closed in from different directions. Rail lines became military lifelines. Troop trains moved east. Supply wagons clogged the roads. Refugees followed the retreat. By December 1916, the capital itself was in danger. Bucharest, once the symbol of Romanian confidence, was becoming a city preparing to be abandoned. The government moved to Iași, deeper in Moldavia, where it could continue the war under the protection of its Russian ally. But a government cannot run a war without money. A state at war needs gold to back its currency, buy supplies, pay debts, and prove that it still exists as a sovereign power. For Romania, the gold reserve of the National Bank was not just wealth. It was national survival. Leaving that gold in Bucharest was impossible. If the Central Powers occupied the capital, they could seize it. But sending it away was also a risk. The only realistic route led into Russia, across territory controlled by Tsar Nicholas II. Romania and Russia were allies, at least on paper. So the decision was made. The treasure would be evacuated by rail and placed in Russian custody until the war ended. At the station, the scene was tense and practical. Soldiers stood beside the wagons. Bank officials checked lists. Crates were sealed. Locomotives waited under steam. Telegraph messages moved ahead of the train. This was not a royal ceremony. It was an emergency evacuation. The cargo was enormous. The gold reserve alone was about 91 tons. Alongside it traveled securities, valuables deposited by private citizens, museum pieces, manuscripts, and other objects of national importance. Some crates represented the Romanian state. Others represented families, businesses, and institutions that had trusted the National Bank. As the train rolled east, it passed through a country under pressure. The front in Transylvania and the Carpathians had collapsed. Iași had become the wartime capital. Military headquarters worked from temporary offices. Maps covered tables. Officers studied railway lines, river crossings, and enemy positions. For many Romanians watching from station platforms, the meaning was simple. The country's gold was leaving. The train crossed into Russian-controlled territory through Bessarabia and continued toward Moscow. At the time, this must have seemed like the safest choice. Russia was vast. Moscow was far from the fighting in Romania. The Romanov Empire still appeared powerful, even though cracks were already forming beneath it. But the train was entering a country on the edge of revolution. By the time the Romanian treasure reached Moscow, the old order in Russia was beginning to break. In 1917, Tsar Nicholas II would be forced to abdicate. The provisional government would struggle to hold authority. Then Lenin and the Bolsheviks would take power, changing Russia and the fate of the treasure forever. For Romania, this was the turning point. The gold had been sent to an ally. Now it was in the hands of a revolutionary state that did not feel bound by the promises of the old empire. The train itself had not stolen the gold in one dramatic moment. The accusation grew slowly, through diplomatic notes, legal arguments, unpaid debts, and political conflict. But the image remained powerful, a nation's wealth rolling east under guard, never again returning in the way its owners expected. This was not a pirate story. It was not a legend of hidden Nazi gold. It was a wartime transfer that became a national dispute, then a diplomatic wound that lasted for generations. Some of the treasure would later be returned. Other parts remained disputed, lost, or politically buried. But the central question remained: when a country sends its gold to an ally for safekeeping, who owns it when that ally collapses? For Romania, the answer would be fought not only in vaults and ministries, but in memory. And it all began with one train leaving Bucharest as the capital waited for occupation. The train left Bucharest just before dawn, its coal-burning engine coughing smoke into the pre-dawn sky. Inside the cargo cars, crates of gold bullion lined the walls like silent sentinels. The weight of over 100 tons of gold, stolen from Romanian banks and government vaults during the chaotic early stages of the war, was a testament to the country's desperation. Romania, under the leadership of Prime Minister Ion Antonescu, had agreed to send its reserves to Germany in exchange for military aid. The gold was to be stored in Berlin, a move meant to secure financial stability during the Allied bombing campaigns. But the journey was fraught. The train, manned by a mix of Romanian soldiers and wonderingly uneasy servants, had to navigate a war-torn landscape. The Carpathian Mountains, once a symbol of national pride, were now a maze of ruined villages and minefields. A single misstep could trigger a catastrophe. Behind the wheel, Colonel Gheorghe Vranceanu, a former cavalry officer turned logistics commander, kept his eyes fixed on the road. He had personally overseen the loading of the gold, ensuring each crate was sealed with double-locked chains. The soldiers on the train carried rifles, not for defense, but to protect the cargo from any sudden attacks by partisans or Soviet forces. The air inside the carriages was thick with dust and the scent of metal. Every movement of the train felt like a gamble. Vranceanu once whispered to a clerk, "If this gold goes down, Romania might as well be finished. We'll have no reserves, no trade, nothing." The train's destination was a compound iniquitously hidden in the German-occupied zone. It was not a bustling city but a cluster of barbed wire fenced warehouses near the Polish border. The exact location was kept secret, even from many of the Romanian officials who had reluctantly agreed to the transfer. The gold would be weighed, then transferred to German bank accounts. But the process was not without its hiccups. One crate was damaged during a U-turn in a narrow valley, forcing the crew to use a crane to salvage it. The crash site was later burned to hide the evidence, a decision that would haunt the survivors. When the train arrived at the compound, it was greeted by a scene of eerie order. German officers in dark uniforms lined up to inspect the cargo. Their secrecy was almost theatrical. A single light flickered above the unloading platform as workers, dressed in civilian clothes, moved the crates with reluctant efficiency. Vranceanu, who had been sworn to secrecy, watched from a distance. His hands shook as he signed the final documentation. He later claimed the secrecy was a mistake, that transparency would have prevented the chaos to come. But the truth was, no one wanted to acknowledge the scale of the loss. The gold was stored in a vault beneath the compound, its entrance sealed with a combination only known to a handful of people. For a time, the operation seemed successful. The German authorities reported the transfer as complete, and Romania's financial crisis appeared to ease. But the secrecy bred suspicion. Rumors spread among Romanian exiles that the gold had been stolen by the Germans. Others claimed it had been hidden in plain sight, used to fund the Nazi war machine. By the time the Soviet army reached Romania in 1944, the vault was empty. The Soviets, whose forces had just liberated Bucharest, were not interested in the gold. They saw it as a symbol of Romania's collaboration with the Axis. The gold was taken to a Soviet military base and stored there, far from the eyes of the world. But the question of ownership became a political minefield. Romania, now under communist rule, claimed the gold as stolen by the Nazis. The Soviet Union, however, argued that the gold had been legitimately transferred and was now theirs to manage. The dispute escalated into a diplomatic crisis, with both sides using the gold as a bargaining chip. Meanwhile, a smaller amount of the gold had escaped detection. A few crates were diverted during the unloading process, hidden in a farmer's barn in western Romania. These were later discovered by a Swiss banker who had once worked for a Romanian bank. He sold the gold to a private collector in Zurich, where it still resides today. The story of this lost gold became a legend, whispered in Romanian folklore as a tale of betrayal and luck. The main pile of gold, however, remained in Soviet hands. After the war, Romania struggled to reclaim it. Negotiations with the Soviet Union were tense, fueled by mutual distrust. The gold was never returned, and Romania's economic recovery was hampered by the loss. The government eventually stopped pressing the issue, preferring to focus on rebuilding rather than relitigating a past catastrophe. But the memory of the train lingered. It became a symbol of how a single act, driven by fear and alliance, could alter a nation's fate. The train's journey was not unique. Other countries had sent gold to neutral or allied nations during the war. France had moved its reserves to Switzerland. Poland had hidden gold in Switzerland as well. But Romania's case was different. Its gold was a direct result of its alliance with Germany, a relationship that had been built on mutual desperation. The decision to send the gold was not made in a strategic war room, but in a series of urgent negotiations, driven by the immediate threat of Allied bombing. The gold was a lifeline, but it also became a liability. The Soviet Union's handling of the gold added another layer of complexity. While they stored it, they also used it for their own purposes. Some of the gold was used to finance Soviet operations in Eastern Europe, a fact that Romania later discovered through intercepted diplomatic cables. This revelation turned the dispute into a geopolitical struggle. Romania accused the Soviets of using its gold to expand their influence, while the Soviets claimed they were merely acting in the interest of their allies. By the 1950s, the issue had faded from global attention. The Cold War had other priorities, and the gold became a footnote in history. Yet, for Romania, it remained a wound. The loss of the gold symbolized the cost of collaboration, a price paid for survival. The train that left Bucharest was never spoken of in official histories, but its story was told in private conversations, in the memories of veterans, and in the occasional news reports about the Swiss collector who still holds the lost crates. The central question of ownership was never fully answered. In legal terms, the gold had been transferred to Germany, which in turn had ceded it to the Soviets. But in the realm of memory, it was anything but clear. Romania's citizens, who had seen their country's wealth transported to a nation that had soon turned against them, carried a lingering resentment. The gold was a reminder of how fragile alliances are, and how easily a single decision can lead to national trauma. The train, now a mere legend, was sometimes compared to other historical anomalies, like the money hidden in Thiage of the Allies, or the gold that disappeared during the Spanish Civil War. But Romania's story was unique because of its direct link to the war's outcome. The gold was not just a material asset, it was a metaphor for the nation's betrayal. In the years that followed, some Romanian historians began to investigate the train's journey. They found records of the cargo, interviews with survivors, and even the names of the workers who handled the gold. One tale, in particular, involved a young engineer named Mihai Popescu, who had been tasked with weighing the gold. He claimed that during the unloading, a German officer had asked him to double-check the count. Popescu, suspecting something was off, insisted on verifying the numbers. When he found discrepancies, he reported them. The officer, enraged, had him transferred to a labor camp. Popescu's story was later disproven, but it became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. The gold's journey also intersected with other historical events. For example, the Soviet Union's post-war financial strategies were influenced by the vast reserves they acquired from Romania and other occupied nations. This resilience allowed them to rebuild their economy faster than many of their allies. Meanwhile, Romania's economy, deprived of its gold, struggled to recover, leading to a series of economic reforms that would shape the country for decades. The dispute over the gold also had cultural implications. In Romania, the loss of the gold became a symbol of national shame. Schools taught that the country had made a critical error by trusting the Nazis. In contrast, in Germany, the gold was largely forgotten, buried beneath the wreckage of the country's war crimes. The only place where the story remained alive was in Switzerland, where the collector who bought the lost crates became a minor celebrity. He never revealed how he acquired the gold, only that it was a family heirloom from a bygone era. Today, the question of the gold remains unanswered. Romania has not officially claimed it, and the Soviet Union no longer exists. The collector in Zurich keeps it hidden, fearing its value might attract thieves. The train that took it away is now a metaphor, a reminder of how history's greatest tragedies are often tied to the simplest of decisions. A train, a vault, a nation's hope. The legacy of the gold is not just in its physical form but in the questions it raises. Who owns what in times of war? How do we measure betrayal? What happens when a nation's survival depends on the trust of its enemies? These questions do not have neat answers. They linger in the archives, in the silence of abandoned vaults, and in the memories of those who lived through the turmoil. The train that stole an entire nation's gold is more than a historical footnote. It is a story of ambition, fear, and the complex web of alliances that define human history. It is a story that continues to unfold, not in the archives, but in the way we remember. Whatever rumors may surround the gold, the documented trail begins in the winter of 1916, when Romania was fighting for survival. The government had fled Bucharest after the Central Powers advanced through the country. Iași, in northeastern Romania, became the wartime capital, crowded with ministers, officers, refugees, and officials carrying the last symbols of a state under pressure. At the center of the crisis was Ion I.C. Brătianu, Romania's prime minister, a man who had brought the country into the war on the side of the Entente. The decision had promised national unity, especially the dream of Transylvania joining Romania. But the military reality was harsh. German, Austro-Hungarian, Bulgarian, and Ottoman forces pushed deep into Romanian territory. Bucharest fell in December 1916. The state itself seemed at risk. In that atmosphere, the Romanian National Bank faced an impossible choice. Its gold reserves could not remain in a country being overrun. If captured, they could finance the enemy and destroy Romania's financial future. The answer was to send the treasure across the border into Russia, then Romania's ally. The agreement was made with Russian officials, who promised safekeeping. The gold was packed into crates and loaded onto trains. These were not ordinary cargo wagons. They carried the financial foundation of a nation: gold coins, reserves, and state assets built over decades. The train moved east under wartime conditions, through snow, damaged lines, military checkpoints, and a collapsing front. The route was not simple. Romania's railways were already strained by troop movements, refugees, and supplies. Every mile east was a gamble. The train was not just transporting wealth, it was transporting sovereignty. If the gold disappeared, Romania's government in exile would lose more than money. It would lose the ability to rebuild. By the time the treasure reached Russia, the empire receiving it was itself close to collapse. Tsar Nicholas II had abdicated in March 1917. The provisional government struggled to hold authority. Then came the Bolshevik Revolution. Lenin's government took power in Petrograd and later moved the capital to Moscow. The Romanian gold arrived into a country being torn apart by revolution, civil war, and foreign intervention. That changed everything. The treasure was no longer simply under the protection of an allied government. It became part of a diplomatic struggle between Romania and the new Soviet state. Romanian officials demanded its return. Soviet officials argued over debts, war losses, and political recognition. What had begun as an emergency wartime deposit became one of the most painful unresolved questions between the two countries. For Romania, the treasure was tied to national dignity. It represented the savings of a kingdom that had entered the war with hope and emerged with victory, but also with exhaustion. Romania had fought on the winning side. It had gained Transylvania, Bukovina, and Bessarabia after the war. Yet the gold remained in the east. The negotiations continued through the interwar years. Romanian diplomats pressed Moscow. Soviet negotiators delayed, disputed, and linked the issue to broader political claims. The treasure became a bargaining chip in a relationship marked by suspicion. Romania saw Bessarabia as part of its national territory. The Soviet Union saw it differently. The gold question became tangled with borders, ideology, and the memory of war. Then the Second World War brought another rupture. In 1940, the Soviet Union occupied Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. Romania, now under Ion Antonescu, joined Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. For a brief period, Romanian forces re-entered territories they had lost. But the question of the gold did not disappear. It was buried beneath a larger war of occupation, alliance, and devastation. After 1944, Romania shifted sides and fell under Soviet influence. A communist government came to power in Bucharest. In that new political order, demanding the full return of the treasure became difficult. Romania was no longer negotiating from a position of independence. It was inside the Soviet sphere. Still, partial returns did take place. In 1935 and 1956, some gold and valuables were returned to Romania. But not all of it. The missing portion became a historical wound, discussed in archives, diplomatic files, and national memory. The exact contents, condition, and final location of every item remain contested. The human story behind the treasure is just as important as the diplomatic one. Romanian bankers, clerks, soldiers, and railway workers handled the crates in 1916 and 1917, often under pressure and without knowing what future awaited them. They were not stealing the gold. They were trying to save it. The tragedy is that the act of protection became an act of loss. Moscow understood the symbolic power of the treasure. For the Soviet state, holding it meant leverage. For Romania, recovering it meant closure. For historians, the records reveal how fragile sovereignty can be when armies are moving and alliances are shifting. The train itself became a symbol because it carried something more valuable than metal. It carried trust. Romania trusted Russia as an ally. Russia, and later the Soviet Union, became the keeper of a promise that was never fully honored. That broken trust shaped the story for generations. In the archives, the treasure appears in lists, inventories, diplomatic notes, and sealed agreements. In memory, it appears as a national question. Where is the gold, and who has the right to decide its fate? The answer depends not only on documents, but on power. The story of the Romanian treasure also shows how war changes ownership. In peacetime, a vault belongs to a bank, and a bank belongs to a state. In war, those lines blur. A government flees. An army advances. A train crosses a border. A promise is made under pressure. Years later, the same promise becomes a dispute